Who is Abimelech? Well, the answer to that question is quite the story of a man who was driven by selfishness, who murdered his way to the top, only to end his life in humiliation. Technically speaking, Abimelech was the first person to be crowned king in Israel. He is recognized as king of Shechem, an area in Israel rather than all of Israel. But interestingly enough, in Judges 9:22, it says he ruled Israel for 3 years. The King James Version of the Bible actually uses the term he reigned in Israel for 3 years. So it seemed that his authority extended further than just Shechem, although it was probably not over the entire nation. This is long before King Saul, who did rule the entire nation, back in the time of Judges. And Abimelech is the son of Gideon, the man who saved Israel from the Midianites. Well, as one of his sons, you see, in many ways, Abimelech is the product of Gideon's mistakes. When Gideon won his great victory, the people said to him, "Be our king." But Gideon knew that God did not want Israel to have a king, so he refuses. Fair enough, all very right and honourable of him. But the problem is, what he said and what he did didn't really match up. Gideon amasses authority, wealth, many wives, concubines. It kind of sounds like a king to me. He didn't take the title, but he took the trappings. He has 70 sons. That's right, 70. I don't know how many wives and concubines he's had, but to have 70 sons, it's got to be a lot. And Abimelech is one of them, born to one of Gideon's concubines. His name means father king, or in other words, my father, the king. So he becomes named after the attitude Gideon seems to develop as he gets older. And because of the way Gideon seems to treat his authority, then there seems to be this mindset of an entitlement amongst his children to rule. See, that's the problem with the king mindset, of course. One that Israel would get to see play out for generation after generation. See, with kings, you get people who feel entitled to rule, regardless of their skills, regardless of whether they're good or whether they're evil. And God wanted Israel to know he was their king. So he gives them judges. Men and women raised up by God, gifted and called, people who serve the nation, and when they are done, they're done. The judges changed, but God didn't. But the trouble with kings is that kingship passes down the hereditary line, regardless of calling, regardless of skill. Judges served the nation. Kings are served by the nation. So Abimelech grows up with a father living like a king, even though he refused the title. And he grows up with a desire to be king himself. After all, he's called my father, the king. But Abimelech has a problem. Well, 69 problems to be exact. Gideon had 70 sons, or 71 if Abimelech isn't included in that figure. And they all had an equal right to that claim as Abimelech, and more for some of them, as he was born to a concubine. Many of them were born to wives. So what does Abimelech do? He goes to his mother's family and says to them, "Wouldn't you rather be ruled by one man instead of 70? So it's interesting here, it's not just Abimelech who expects one of the sons of Gideon to become ruler. If that wasn't the case, this gambit of his wouldn't have worked. So he gathers a crew and he murders all of his brothers. They are all in his father's house, presumably for some kind of family occasion. So he gets them all at once. It says they were killed upon the stone, which suggests that the murders took place on the altar that Gideon had built, which is interesting. It suggests a formality to the deaths almost, that he viewed their deaths as a sacrifice that was needed for him to rule. And all of them died because he felt he had a right to rule. Only one of them escapes, the youngest son, Jotham, who hid when the massacre occurs, all because of his entitlement. Church, we need to be careful about the things we think we have a right for, the things we feel entitled for, because when we feel that we have a right, we can do damaging things we would never do in other circumstances. And they make him king in Shechem. He rules for 3 years, but God would not allow his time to be long. And the very people who placed him in power, the leaders of Shechem, turned on him, and a civil war breaks out. Abimelech attacks the leaders of Shechem, and they gather in a strong tower. He sets the tower on fire and kills them all. 1,000 people died in that fire. He then pursues his enemies to a town called Thebes. Again, the leaders take refuge in a tower. Guess they hadn't heard what happened last time. And Abimelech has the same plan. Burn it, just like he did in Shechem. But before he can, as he's approaching the tower, a woman in the tower drops a millstone, a rock that's about 18 inches in diameter, out of a window. In his confidence, he got too close to the wall. The stone hits his head, smashes it open. His own hubris was the cause of his death. Ironically, in some ways, his brothers died on a stone, and his death is by a stone. And he's embarrassed about this. Killed by a woman, he feels humiliated. So lying there on the ground with his smashed in head, he calls his armor bearer to him and says, "Kill me with a sword, so that nobody can say I was killed by a woman." But of course, the final humiliation is that whenever his story is told, even recorded in scripture, is that not only was he killed by a woman, but that he was embarrassed by it, which somehow makes his death even less dignified. And this was the first attempt to have a king in Israel. Maybe somebody should have learned a lesson here. What lesson can we learn? Church, we need to be very careful when we feel like we're owed something. Entitlement, when it's pursued, can lead to such selfish and destructive behaviour. Abimelech didn't want to leave because he thought he had something to offer, but because he thought he had the right. Position should never be a right, but a calling given by God. Leading should never be for our own gain. That was the whole point of having judges instead of kings in the first place. The judges made a stand for a nation. Abimelech only ever stood for himself. He did what was right for him. He never thought about the other people that he trampled. He is such a negative example of a leadership for the wrong reasons, brought about in the wrong way, and the damage that it can do. Leaders should seek to be servants, not those who are served. But also there's a lesson to be learned in Gideon's life here. Don't let your legacy be like this. He sowed the seeds of this himself, because whilst he said where he refused the title of king, he did live like one. Our legacy matters. See, we can do great things and undo them all if we don't guard our legacy. Live well and leave well. Bless you, church.